He's the Prime Minister you can have on in the background. Keir No Drama Starmer, the Labour leader now resident in 10 Downing Street. What with all the news out of America, his new government hasn't received that much international attention. I was in Britain last week and Keir Starmer wasn't always headline news there either. In fact, there were times when he himself seemed momentarily to forget he was now in charge.
We will, of course, work with others. And in relation to the particular point, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, old habits die hard. The point that the Leader of the Opposition put me on security and cooperation with our EU allies.
A parliamentary exchange there with the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who for now at least remains the leader of the opposition. So how is the new PM bedding in and what lessons has he learnt from the Labour government here in Australia? There are quite a few, according to Marc Stears, who runs the Policy Lab at University College London. He was also a speechwriter for the former Labour leader Ed Miliband. Marc, thanks for joining us on Saturday Extra.
Great to be here, Nick.
After all the chaos, Mark, of the Brexit years, when Britain changed prime ministers even more frequently than Australia, what's been striking to me is how uneventful these opening weeks have been. I mean, do you agree with that? And was that what the British electorate was actually voting for?
Yeah, one of Keir Starmer's sort of lines in his stump speech that he would give during the campaign is that he wanted politics to tread more lightly on our lives. And it's certainly been like that here, once he's taken over. All of the shouting and the rows and the parliamentary chaos has sort of been replaced with this very no-drama approach to change. And that's partly Keir Starmer's personality.
We'll get to the substance of the new Labour government in a minute, but I want to ask first of all about the style of Keir Starmer's prime ministership. I noticed, for instance, he keeps walking around with a folder under his arm. It's a very elegant crimson leather folder with a gold coat of arms, but he seems very focused. He seems very workmanlike. Is that the kind of image he wants to portray?
Yeah, absolutely. He took, again, during the campaign, much to some of his advisors' sort of disgust, he took to wearing a very serious pair of spectacles. And it was definitely sort of, segueing into this new image he has of a sort of, high school principal. And he rolls his sleeves up whenever he can and he's sort of getting on with the job. And the images that they've been releasing from Downing Street, but they are of sort of, serious man at work, often seen, as you said, with his folder climbing up the stairs of Downing Street.
In the run-up to the election, he told the Financial Times that his slogan could easily be, "Make Britain serious again." There is a degree of steadfast seriousness, he said, that is much needed across the country. Now, it's not the sort of talk that gets your kind of political heart racing, but again, is Britain ready to have its political heart rate slowed down?
Yeah, it seems so. I think when Keir Starmer started with this approach, a few years ago, all of the commentators and journalists sort of mocked him for it and said it was boring. They described his now Chancellor at the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, in similar terms. As she was described as snoring boring by a BBC journalist. But it definitely seems to have gone down quite well with the public at large. Who've had their share of sort of Boris Johnson boosterism and all of those big Brexit rows, and then sort of far left radicalism from Jeremy Corbyn. And I think a large number of people have said, well, we don't really want any of that. It's sort of big and it's puffed up. It doesn't really lead to anything.
And you didn't mention Liz Truss, of course, Britain's shortest serving prime minister, a prime minister who you actually taught at Oxford University, right?
Absolutely, that's why I left her out, yeah.
And you tell an amazing story about how she used to come back with essays that weren't grounded in any basis of fact. Is that true?
Yeah, Liz was a great student to teach in a way because she was always full of energy and sort of creativity. But she was always really clear that, she would make up a story if she thought it was good, and that she didn't really see anything wrong with that. So, far fewer textbooks under Liz's arms than there are sort of folders under Keir's.
Now, he has this massive Labour majority in Parliament, 174 seats, but he won power off the back of a historically small share of the national vote, around 34%. Is he governing as if he's won a landslide with a decisive mandate, or a leader wary of the fact that that vote share really wasn't that strong?
It's a bit of both, and I think you've put your finger on probably the biggest choice that they have to make, really, which is, do they take advantage of this huge parliamentary majority in order to push through some, sort of transformative pieces of legislation that the Labour Party has long been supportive of, or do they move more cautiously to try to shore up their, strange electoral coalition and hope not to alienate any of the folks who voted for them for the first time this time round? So, I think if there is a strategic challenge in Downing Street today, it's that between sort of boldness and caution. Starmer's personal style probably leads towards caution anyway. But on the other hand, with that huge parliamentary majority that they're unlikely to get next time, there are lots of people in his ear saying, no, take the chance whilst you've got it and get some big things done.
Now, you do think that lessons have been learnt from the Albanese government here in Australia, both in how to win power and then how to wield power. Just tell me, first of all, what electoral lessons they learnt from the Australian Labor Party in actually fighting the general election.
I mean, I was really struck over the last handful of years just how many people from the Australian Labor Party were either in London advising Starmer and his team or, at the end of a Zoom call advising from Canberra. I mean, there was a really strong sense that Albanese had got his electoral strategy right, especially after the defeat of Bill Shorten, and that, Keir Starmer went into this election with what he called a small target, not promising too much, but promising some specific things which he thought would get people on side. So really, the Australians were, sort of shining a light forward as far as the UK Labour Party were concerned. So lots and lots and lots of enthusiasm here for the way that Albanese campaigned. A little bit of anxiety, I think, about how the Albanese government has gone in practice.
Well, thrash that out for me and unpack that thought, because you've spoken about the missteps of the Albanese government and how Labour politicians in Britain have kept a very close eye on that. What do you mean precisely?
I mean, I think the key for Starmer's strategists here has been what's called a working people focus. So the idea essentially has been that, people who don't have, particularly high paying jobs or, have been really squeezed by the cost of living or who rely on public services which aren't as high quality as they used to be, have turned away from the Conservatives and to Labour in order to get those things fixed. And when the UK Labour Party looks across to Australia, they kind of think, well, that's what Albanese promised in the election too, sort of action on wages, action on cost of living, a sort of resolute focus on very everyday concerns, nothing too big, nothing too grandiose, nothing kind of made up. And so Labour here in the UK is thinking, okay, that's what we need to do in government.
Mark, I'm always struck by how often Britain takes its political cues now from Australia. In his scorching polemic, The Lucky Country, Donald Horne argued that Australia not only had second-rate politicians, but its democracy was second-hand. It was imitative. It borrowed too heavily from Britain. But in recent decades, the opposite almost has been true. Tony Blair's New Labour was a British working of the Hawke-Keating project. The Conservative Party's immigration policies, they've borrowed very heavily from John Howard's Pacific solution. It does seem that Australia now is a place that British politicians look to for ideas, strategies and tactics.
So much. I mean, it across, as you said, across the political spectrum, the Conservative side borrowing from the coalition, Labour borrowing from Labour, and, all of those people who make their living in Canberra giving strategic advice or doing opinion polling, making their way over to London and probably making even more money here before they head back home again. I mean, it's been remarkable to see. I mean, Rishi Sunak running a campaign with Stop the Boats sort of written on the podium wherever he went. And, at times repositioning himself as a sort of Scott Morrison figure, which was kind of ridiculous given their differences in background and style, but which just showed how much the strategy had been borrowed from Australian sources. And certainly on the Labour side too. I mean, one of the things Keir Starmer did really well in this election campaign was tell his own personal story of growing up as a working class kid. And he got mocked by some journalists for continually telling people the story of his dad, who was a tool maker, a working class profession in the south of England. But clearly, a lot of that was borrowed from the way that Albanese also told his personal story so effectively during the last campaign in Australia. So, from style to substance to bits of legislative suggestion, the UK is copying Australian politics all of the time at the moment.
It's been explained to me that the easiest way at the moment to get a British minister interested in an idea is actually to tell them it came from Australia, which is interesting. What we saw in Britain is also what we've seen this century in Australia, the decline of the major parties. On the right, you had the rise of Nigel Farage Reform UK Party. On its left flank, Labour lost seats to pro-Palestinian independence and to the Greens. Do you think now that that trend is irreversible?
I mean, I think certainly what we seem to be in a moment of sort of test for what we in Britain would call mainstream social democracy. So, the kind of politics that Albanese and Starmer represent, they kind of have a chance, they have a moment, but there are lots of headwinds that they're going into. So Labour here, as you mentioned before, huge majority with about a third of the vote. And they realise that if they don't make the most of this particular opportunity, then those voters will go probably to the extremes of both left and right. So there's a sense here, I think, of foreboding that, you've got 3-4 years now to really make an impact.
Just to return to Keir Starmer, I mean, the press tend to judge leaders these days by their journalistic entertainment value, which is partly why Donald Trump ended up as the President of the United States and partly why Boris Johnson ended up as the Prime Minister of the UK. Is that going to be a problem for no drama Starmer going forward? He's just too boring.
He always hates it when people say that because he doesn't think of himself as boring. My friend Tom Baldwin wrote a wonderful biography of Starmer just before the election, and there's a new edition of that coming out, and it will grapple with that question because, Starmer sees himself very much as sort of everyday Britain. His passions are football and, walking in the hills. And he doesn't think of himself as boring. He thinks of himself as ordinary. And I think you're going to see that as the way that he approaches this question, which is that he really wants to make people think that he respects ordinary people because he comes from a background like theirs, that the things he cares about are the same things as them. He's going to want to try to, kind of relate his political experiences to their everyday experiences, and he's going to hope that that's the foundation for his success.
Well, there's a lot to be said in this crazy political world right now for ordinary and boring. Marc Stears, thank you so much for joining us on Saturday Extra.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Marc Stears, who runs the Policy Lab at University College London, who also used to run the Policy Lab at Sydney University, a former speechwriter for Ed Miliband, who is now the Energy Minister in Britain. Well, I'm Nick Bryant. Stay with me on RN. We're getting a lot of text on that housing discussion. Historically, we've had a lot of public housing, but now it's just at 3% because government stopped building it. Public housing is what we need for low-income people who sadly make up more and more of society. Well, after the news, we'll be talking about the history of the opening ceremonies. It's been a pretty spectacular display in Paris, although there's been a lot of rain, unfortunately, as well. Stay with me after the news.